The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall, as New York's elite gathered for what everyone called the event of the season. The Meridian Charity Gala had become legendary over the years, not just for the millions raised, but for the exclusive guest list that read like a who's who of power and wealth. Tonight was special, though. The organizers had managed to secure Harrison Drake as their keynote speaker, and that alone had driven ticket prices to $25,000 per person. Drake wasn't just any billionaire. He was the kind of tech mogul whose name appeared on magazine covers and whose every business move made headlines around the world. At 52, Harrison had built his empire from a college dorm room idea into a global technology corporation worth over $40 billion. He owned homes on 3 continents, traveled in private jets, and had been featured on the cover of Time magazine twice. But what really set him apart was his reputation for being untouchable, almost superhuman in his success. As guests sipped champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week, they whispered about Drake's latest ventures and wondered what insights he might share during his speech. The evening's goal was ambitious: raise $10 million for children's hospitals across the country. It seemed fitting that someone of Drake's stature would help them reach such a lofty target. But while the guests mingled in their designer gowns and $1,000 suits, an entirely different world operated just beyond their view. In the museum's service areas and makeshift kitchen spaces, a team of 30 catering staff worked with the kind of precision that comes from years of serving events where one mistake could end a career. Maria Santos moved through the controlled chaos with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. At 34, she owned Santos Catering, a company she had started 5 years earlier after being laid off from her corporate job. What began as a desperate attempt to pay rent had grown into a respected business that employed 28 people full-time. Maria understood pressure. Every event was a test. Every satisfied client was a victory, and every mistake was a lesson that could cost thousands of dollars. Tonight's gala represented her biggest contract yet, and she had handpicked her team carefully. These weren't just employees, they were people she trusted with her reputation and her livelihood. Carlos Rodriguez had been with Maria's company for 3 years, but his background was unlike most servers. For a decade, he had worked as an emergency medical technician, racing through city streets to save lives and provide critical care in the most stressful situations imaginable. Budget cuts had eliminated his position, forcing him to find work wherever he could. Catering paid the bills, but he missed the adrenaline and purpose of his former career. Despite wearing a server's uniform, Carlos still carried himself like someone trained to handle emergencies. His eyes constantly scanned crowds, noting exits and potential problems. It was a habit he couldn't shake, and one that had served Maria's team well during past events, when guests had too much to drink or minor accidents occurred. Moving between the kitchen and serving areas was Dr. Jennifer Kim. Though none of the guests would ever guess her credentials, at 29, she was in her final year of medical residency, specializing in emergency medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital. The demanding schedule of a resident physician barely paid enough to cover basic living expenses, let alone the crushing debt from medical school. Working catering events on her nights off wasn't glamorous, but it helped pay for groceries and chipped away at the loans that would follow her for years to come. Jennifer had learned to shift seamlessly between her two worlds. One day performing life-saving procedures in a trauma bay, the next serving appetizers to people who had never worried about money. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Many of the guests at events like this donated generously to hospitals and medical research, yet the doctors and nurses who actually provided the care often struggled financially. It was one of those ironies that made Jennifer appreciate the complexity of how society actually worked. As the evening progressed, the 300 guests took their seats at elegantly decorated tables. The dinner service went flawlessly, with Maria's team moving like a well-rehearsed dance troupe. Plates appeared and disappeared without disruption. Wine glasses stayed filled and the conversation flowed as smoothly as the expensive champagne. Drake himself seemed to be enjoying the evening. He sat at the head table, engaging in animated conversation with fellow executives and philanthropists. Occasionally he would laugh at something someone said, and the sound carried across the room with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about tomorrow. When the time came for speeches, The event organizers introduced various dignitaries and major donors. Each speaker talked about the importance of supporting children's health care and the difference that tonight's fundraising would make. The audience applauded politely, but everyone was really waiting for the main event. Finally, the moment arrived. The master of ceremonies, a well-known television news anchor, stepped to the podium with obvious excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, a visionary leader who has transformed not just the technology industry, but our entire understanding of innovation and possibility, Harrison Drake. The applause was thunderous. 500 people rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. Drake walked to the podium with the easy stride of someone accustomed to such receptions. He adjusted the microphone, smiled at the crowd, and began to speak. "Thank you for that incredible welcome," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "When I look out at this room tonight, I see the power of human compassion and generosity. Each of you has chosen to be here not for personal gain, but to make a difference in the lives of children who need our help most." In the back of the room, Maria monitored her team as they began clearing the dinner service. Carlos moved between tables with practiced efficiency, while Jennifer helped coordinate the final courses. All three occasionally glanced toward the stage, caught up despite themselves in Drake's compelling presence. "The technology that built my company has always been about solving problems," Drake continued. "Tonight, we're here to solve one of humanity's oldest challenges, ensuring that every child has access to the medical care they deserve, regardless of their family's circumstances." The audience hung on his every word. This was why they had paid $25,000 per ticket, to hear insights from one of the most successful people alive, to feel connected to something larger than their already privileged lives. But as Drake spoke about giving back and making a difference, something was happening that no one in the audience noticed. Carlos, clearing tables near the stage, found his attention drawn not to Drake's words but to something else entirely. His EMT training had conditioned him to notice subtle signs that others missed, and something about the speaker's posture seemed off. Drake continued his speech, discussing plans for mobile medical units and technology-enhanced diagnostic tools for underserved communities. The audience was captivated, some wiping away tears as he described children he had met during hospital visits. This was Drake at his most human, most relatable. Then, in the middle of a sentence about hope and healing, Harrison Drake suddenly stopped speaking. He looked confused for a moment, as if he had forgotten his words. The audience waited patiently, assuming he was pausing for dramatic effect, but Carlos was already moving. Carlos had seen that look before. During his 10 years as an EMT, he had learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed completely. The slight pallor, the way someone's left hand unconsciously moved toward their chest, the momentary confusion that crossed their face. These were the warning signals that could mean the difference between life and death. Drake was still standing at the podium, but something was very wrong. His confident posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. His left hand had moved to his chest, and he seemed to be struggling to find his words. The audience, comfortable in their elegant chairs, assumed this was simply a dramatic pause in what had been a compelling speech. But Carlos was already weaving between tables, moving toward the stage with the purposeful stride of someone who had responded to thousands of emergency calls. His server's uniform meant nothing now. His EMT training had kicked in, and every instinct told him to get closer to the stage. "As I was saying," Drake continued, his voice slightly strained, "the children we serve today will become the leaders of tomorrow, and we must ensure—" His words trailed off. The confusion on his face deepened, and he gripped the podium with both hands. The audience stirred slightly, murmuring among themselves. Some assumed he was overcome with emotion by his own words. Others wondered if he was having technical difficulties with his microphone. These were people accustomed to polished presentations and flawless performances, so they waited patiently for whatever came next. From her position near the kitchen entrance, Maria noticed Carlos moving with unusual urgency. She had learned to trust her team's instincts, especially Carlos, whose background often proved valuable during events. Something in his body language made her put down the serving tray she was carrying and start paying closer attention to what was happening on stage. Dr. Jennifer Kim was stacking plates when she heard the change in Drake's voice. Her medical training had taught her to notice vocal distress, and Something about the way his words had become strained caught her attention immediately. She looked toward the stage just as Drake's face went pale. "I'm sorry," Drake said into the microphone, his voice now clearly labored. "I seem to be having some difficulty." He swayed slightly and his grip on the podium tightened. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. The audience was no longer patient. A concerned murmur spread through the crowd as people realized something was genuinely wrong. Cell phones began appearing as guests instinctively started recording what might become a historic moment. But none of them moved from their seats. They were spectators in designer clothing, unsure how to respond to a real crisis unfolding before them. Carlos reached the front of the room just as Drake's knees buckled. The billionaire's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed behind the podium with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly silent hall. For a moment, everything stopped. 500 of the most powerful people in New York sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the stage where one of the world's most successful men had just crumpled to the floor. That moment of shocked silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then the chaos began. People jumped to their feet, shouting questions and instructions that nobody was following. Cell phones were raised as guests began filming and photographing the scene. Someone screamed. Others called out asking if anyone was a doctor. But while the wealthy elite stood paralyzed by the unprecedented situation, 3 people in catering uniforms were already in motion. Carlos vaulted onto the stage without hesitation. His years of emergency response had taught him that the first few minutes after a cardiac event were absolutely critical. Every second mattered, and there was no time for doubt or deliberation. He dropped to his knees beside Drake, immediately checking for breathing and a pulse. "No pulse, no breathing," he called out, his voice cutting through the pandemonium with the authority of someone trained to take charge in life-threatening situations. Without waiting for permission or instruction, he positioned his hands on Drake's chest and began CPR compressions. Jennifer had already dropped everything and was rushing toward the stage, pushing through guests who were milling around in confusion. Her medical bag was back in her car, but she didn't need equipment to assess the situation. As she climbed onto the stage, she could see that Carlos was performing textbook chest compressions. "I'm a doctor," she announced loudly, taking her place beside Carlos. She checked Drake's airway while Carlos continued compressions. Their movements synchronized like a team that had worked together for years instead of people who barely knew each other. Meanwhile, Maria was proving that leadership skills transfer across any situation. While everyone else was either filming or standing around asking what they should do, she was already coordinating a response. She grabbed the master of ceremonies who was standing nearby looking bewildered. "Call 911 immediately," she told him firmly. "Tell them we have a man in cardiac arrest at the Metropolitan Museum. We need paramedics now." When he hesitated, she actually took his phone from his hands and began dialing herself. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Hundreds of people with combined wealth in the billions stood helplessly watching while 3 catering employees fought to save a life. These were individuals who controlled corporations and influenced government policy, yet they had no idea how to respond to a medical emergency happening right in front of them. "Someone needs to clear this area," Jennifer called out as she and Carlos worked. The crowd of onlookers was pressing closer, making their job harder and potentially interfering with the emergency response that would arrive soon. Maria immediately took charge of crowd control. "Everyone, please step back," she announced with the kind of authority that comes from running a business and managing people under pressure. "Give them room to work. If you're not helping, you're in the way." Most of the guests retreated, but many continued filming with their phones. This was, after all, an unprecedented moment. Harrison Drake, one of the most powerful men alive, was fighting for his life on the floor of a charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "How long until the ambulance arrives?" Carlos asked, continuing his chest compressions without breaking rhythm. His EMT training had taught him that you never stop CPR until professional medical help takes over. "No matter how tired you get." "Dispatch says 12 minutes, Maria replied, having gotten through to emergency services. In Manhattan traffic, especially with an event like this, 12 minutes could feel like forever. Jennifer checked her watch and began counting compressions. "We can do this," she said, both to Carlos and to herself. "We just need to keep him going until help arrives." Around them, the wealthy guests watched in fascination and horror. Many of them had attended charity galas for medical causes, written checks to hospitals, and given speeches about the importance of healthcare. But they had never seen medical care actually being provided, especially under such dramatic circumstances. Some guests began whispering among themselves. Who were these catering workers who seemed to know exactly what they were doing? The server performing CPR moved with the confidence of a trained professional. The young woman assisting him was clearly medically trained, and the woman coordinating everything was displaying leadership skills that many executives in the room would envy. "Switch," Jennifer said after several minutes, tapping Carlos on the shoulder. CPR was exhausting work, and they needed to maintain effective compressions until paramedics arrived. Carlos moved aside without argument, and Jennifer took over chest compressions while he monitored Drake's airway and breathing. The role reversal continued seamlessly. Maria had not only called for emergency help, but had also directed other catering staff to control the exits, ensuring paramedics would have clear access when they arrived. She had turned off the room's music and asked guests to put away their phones out of respect for Drake's privacy. As the minutes ticked by, something extraordinary was happening. The people everyone had barely noticed all evening, the servers, the kitchen staff, the woman who ran the catering company, had become the most important people in the room. They were the ones with the skills, the training, and the presence of mind to respond when it really mattered. And Harrison Drake's life hung in the balance, depending entirely on three people whose names weren't on the guest list but whose actions would determine whether he survived the night. The sound of sirens piercing through Manhattan's evening traffic had never been more welcome. After what felt like an eternity but was actually 11 minutes, paramedics burst through the museum's main entrance with equipment that could make the difference between life and death. Carlos and Jennifer had maintained CPR the entire time, switching back and forth when exhaustion set in, refusing to give up on the man whose life literally depended on their efforts. "We've got a pulse," one of the paramedics announced as they took over compressions and attached their equipment. The collective sigh of relief from the watching crowd was audible throughout the grand hall. Drake was alive, but barely. The paramedics worked quickly, establishing IV lines and monitoring his heart rhythm as they prepared to transport him to Mount Sinai Hospital. As they wheeled Drake out on a stretcher, the surreal nature of what had just happened began to sink in. One of the world's most powerful men had collapsed at his own charitable event, and his life had been saved not by fellow billionaires or high-profile doctors in attendance, but by three members of the catering staff who had happened to have the right training at exactly the right moment. The remaining guests gradually dispersed, their conversations hushed and their planned after-party celebrations forgotten. Many would later describe it as the most dramatic evening of their lives, a night when they witnessed not just a medical emergency, but a profound reminder of who the real heroes in society actually are. 3 days later, Harrison Drake opened his eyes in a private room at Mount Sinai Hospital. The quadruple bypass surgery had been successful, and his doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. As the fog of medication and unconsciousness lifted, Drake began to piece together what had happened to him that night. The last thing he remembered clearly was standing at the podium, talking about children's health care, and then everything went black. "You're incredibly lucky," his cardiologist explained during morning rounds. "Cardiac arrest outside of a hospital is usually fatal. The fact that you received immediate CPR made all the difference. Without it, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Drake nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. He had built his empire on information, on understanding every detail of every situation that affected his life and business. But he had no memory of the critical moments when strangers had fought to keep him alive. "Who performed the CPR?" he asked weakly. "According to the paramedics, it was members of your catering staff," the doctor replied. "They maintained compressions for nearly 12 minutes until professional help arrived." Textbook response, actually. That afternoon, Drake's executive assistant Rebecca arrived with his laptop and phone, expecting to help him catch up on urgent business matters. Instead, Drake asked her to do something unusual. He wanted to see the security footage from the museum that night. Something about owing his life to people he had never noticed bothered him deeply. Rebecca contacted the museum's security department, and within hours they had obtained all available footage from the evening. What they discovered when they reviewed the recordings changed. Everything Drake thought he knew about what had happened, the cameras had captured something. that no human eye had noticed during the chaos of the evening. While Drake was still speaking normally at the podium, the footage clearly showed Carlos moving away from his assigned serving section and heading toward the stage. The timestamp revealed something remarkable. Carlos had begun moving toward Drake 30 seconds before the collapse occurred. "Run that section again," Drake instructed from his hospital bed, watching intently as they replayed the crucial moments. There it was, clear as day. Carlos had somehow sensed trouble before anyone else in the room, including Drake himself. Further review of the footage revealed even more impressive details. When Drake actually collapsed, the camera angles showed the 3 catering staff members responding with a coordination and efficiency that spoke to serious professional training. This wasn't luck or good instincts. These people clearly knew exactly what they were doing. "I want to know everything about these 3 people," Drake told Rebecca. "Full background checks, employment history, everything. And I want it yesterday." Rebecca had worked for Drake for 8 years and had never seen him this focused on something that wasn't directly related to business. But she had also never seen him come so close to death, so she understood that this was different. She reached out to Drake Industries' security team, the same people who investigated potential business partners and merger targets. What they discovered over the next 24 hours painted a picture that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Carlos Rodriguez had indeed been an EMT. But the story behind his career change was more complex than anyone had realized. He had worked for the New York City Fire Department for 10 years, responding to over 3,000 emergency calls. His personnel file was filled with commendations for bravery and life-saving actions. He had pulled people from burning buildings, revived overdose victims, and talked suicidal individuals off bridges. But municipal budget cuts in 2019 had eliminated over 200 EMT positions citywide. Carlos, despite his exemplary record, was laid off along with dozens of other experienced first responders. With a family to support and bills to pay, he had taken whatever work he could find. Catering paid better than most service jobs, and Maria's company had a reputation for treating employees fairly. The investigation into Dr. Jennifer Kim revealed an even more poignant story. She was not just any medical resident. She was one of the top performers in her program at Mount Sinai, the very hospital where Drake was now recovering. Her supervising physicians described her as brilliant, dedicated, and destined for greatness in emergency medicine. But Jennifer's path to becoming a doctor had been anything but easy. Her parents had immigrated from South Korea when she was 5 years old, speaking no English and working multiple minimum wage jobs to support their family. Jennifer had earned a full academic scholarship to Columbia University, then worked her way through medical school while caring for her aging parents. Medical residency paid roughly $35,000 per year, barely enough to survive in New York City, let alone pay back student loans or support 2 parents who had sacrificed everything for their daughter's education. Working catering events on her nights off wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. Every extra dollar went toward groceries, rent, or chipping away at the massive debt that medical school had created. The background check on Maria Santos revealed a story of entrepreneurship born from necessity. She had worked in corporate marketing for 12 years, climbing the ladder at a prestigious advertising firm. But the 2018 recession had hit her industry hard, and she was laid off along with 30% of her company's workforce. At 34, with no job prospects and bills mounting, Maria had used her savings to start a catering business from her apartment. She began by preparing food for small office parties and birthday celebrations, gradually building a reputation for quality and reliability. Her business grew not through venture capital or investor funding, but through word-of-mouth recommendations and sheer determination. What made Maria's story particularly compelling was her hiring philosophy. She specifically sought out employees who were facing economic challenges, people who had been laid off, recent immigrants, individuals returning to the workforce after difficult periods. She provided stable employment, fair wages, and the kind of respect that many service workers rarely experienced. The security report revealed that Maria's company had become something of an informal support network. Employees helped each other find housing, shared childcare responsibilities, and pooled resources during emergencies. It wasn't just a catering company. It was a community of people helping each other survive and thrive in an expensive city. As Drake read through these detailed reports from his hospital bed, He felt something he had rarely experienced in his successful life: genuine humility. These three people who had saved his life weren't just random service workers who happened to be in the right place at the right time. They were highly skilled professionals who had been forced by circumstances beyond their control to take jobs that didn't match their qualifications or experience. Carlos was a decorated first responder working as a server. Jennifer was a brilliant doctor in training serving appetizers to pay her bills. Maria was a talented entrepreneur who had built her business from nothing while providing opportunities for others facing similar challenges. The irony was overwhelming. Drake had spent the evening talking about helping children and giving back to society, while the people who actually saved his life were struggling with the very problems his foundation claimed to address. They were the ones providing essential services, training the next generation of doctors, and creating jobs for people who needed them most. And they had done it all without recognition, without praise, and certainly without the kind of financial security that would let them focus completely on their important work. Drake closed the laptop and stared out his hospital window at the city below. Everything was about to change. Against his doctor's advice and over the strong objections of his security team, Harrison Drake left the hospital after just 5 days. He had insisted on checking out early because he had something important to do, something that couldn't wait for his full recovery. His assistant Rebecca had arranged a schedule of meetings, but these weren't business meetings. They were personal visits, and Drake had made it clear that he wanted to handle them himself, without lawyers or PR teams or corporate representatives. The first stop was a modest apartment building in Queens. Drake's black sedan looked out of place among the older cars parked on the street, and his security detail remained nervous about the unfamiliar neighborhood. But Drake had been firm about this. He was going to meet the people who saved his life on their own terms, in their own environment. Carlos opened the door to find one of the world's richest men standing in his hallway, looking healthier than expected but somehow smaller than he had appeared on stage. Drake's usual confident demeanor was replaced by something Carlos had never seen in wealthy clients: genuine nervousness. "Mr. Rodriguez," Drake said, extending his hand. "I'm Harrison Drake. I believe I owe you my life." Carlos invited him in, still processing the surreal situation. His wife Anna was at work and their 2 young children were at school, so the apartment was quiet. The living room was small but comfortable, decorated with family photos and children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. "Please, sit down," Carlos said, gesturing to their couch. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Drake sat down, looking around the apartment with genuine curiosity. This was as far from his usual environment as possible, yet he seemed more relaxed than Carlos had ever seen him during the gala. "Coffee would be great, thank you." As Carlos prepared coffee in the kitchen, Drake studied the family photographs on the walls. There were pictures of Carlos in his EMT uniform, receiving commendations, standing beside ambulances. There were graduation photos, birthday parties, and everyday family moments that spoke to a rich life that had nothing to do with money. "I've read your file," Drake said when Carlos returned with 2 cups of coffee. 10 years as an EMT, over 3,000 emergency calls, multiple commendations for bravery and life-saving actions. Carlos nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "It was good work. Important work. I miss it. I understand you were laid off due to budget cuts." "Along with a lot of other people," Carlos replied. "The city had to make tough choices. I don't blame anyone for that." Drake set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "What if I told you that those budget cuts were a mistake? What if I told you that your skills and experience are exactly what this city needs, and exactly what my company needs?" Carlos looked confused. "I don't understand." "I want to offer you a position as head of emergency response for all Drake Industries facilities worldwide," Drake said. "We have offices in 32 countries, manufacturing plants, data centers, research facilities, thousands of employees who deserve to have someone with your training and experience looking out for their safety." The offer was so unexpected that Carlos didn't know how to respond. I'm not sure I understand." "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you the chance to do what you were trained to do, what you're passionate about at a level that could save hundreds of lives over the course of your career. The salary would be $150,000 annually, plus benefits, plus a budget to hire and train a team of emergency responders." Carlos stared at Drake in disbelief. It was more money than he had ever imagined earning, doing work that would give his life the kind of purpose and meaning that catering, however necessary, simply couldn't provide. The second visit was to Mount Sinai Hospital, where Dr. Jennifer Kim was just finishing a 36-hour shift in the emergency department. Drake had arranged to meet her in the hospital's quiet cafeteria during her break, wanting to see her in the environment where she was training to become a life-saving physician. Jennifer appeared exhausted but alert, still wearing her scrubs and white coat. She recognized Drake immediately, having seen him during his stay at the hospital, though they had never been formally introduced. "Dr. Kim," Drake said, standing up as she approached. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Jennifer sat down across from him, curious but cautious. "How are you feeling?" "Your recovery has been remarkable. Thanks in large part to your quick thinking and medical expertise that night," Drake replied. "I've learned about your background, about your training, about the financial challenges you're facing while trying to become a doctor." Jennifer's expression became guarded. She wasn't used to wealthy patients taking personal interest in her financial situation, and she worried about where this conversation might be heading. "I want to do something about your medical school debt," Drake continued. "All of it. Complete forgiveness so you can focus on your training and your patients instead of worrying about money." Jennifer's eyes widened. Her student loans totaled nearly $300,000, a crushing burden that would follow her for decades. "I don't understand. Why would you do that?" "Because that night, you proved that you're exactly the kind of doctor this world needs," Drake said. "But more than that, I want to fund a research position for you. Emergency cardiology research, with a focus on early detection and response. Your own lab, your own budget, the freedom to pursue research that could prevent what happened to me from happening to other people." The offer was overwhelming. Jennifer had dreamed of combining clinical work with research, but the financial realities of medical training had made that seem impossible. Research positions were competitive and rarely paid enough to justify the additional years of training they required. "You would do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would do this because of you," Drake corrected. "Because you've already proven that you can save lives, and I want to give you the resources to save even more." The third visit was to Maria's catering kitchen, a converted warehouse space in Brooklyn where her company prepared food for events throughout the city. Drake arrived during the busy afternoon prep time, when Maria's team was preparing for 3 separate events that evening. Maria was in her element, coordinating multiple tasks while maintaining the kind of quality control that had built her company's reputation. She noticed Drake's arrival but continued working, finishing her conversation with the chef about dietary restrictions for one of the evening's events, before walking over to greet him. "Mr. Drake," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is unexpected. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you and your team," Drake replied, looking around the bustling kitchen with obvious admiration. "I wanted to see your operation, to understand how you built all this." Maria gave him a quick tour, introducing him to her employees and explaining the various aspects of her business. Drake was impressed not just by the efficiency of the operation, but by the obvious respect and loyalty between Maria and her staff. These weren't just employees. They were people who genuinely cared about each other and took pride in their work. "I have a proposition for you," Drake said when they returned to Maria's small office. "I want Santos Catering to handle all Drake Industries events for the next 5 years. Every corporate meeting, every product launch, every charity gala. Exclusive contract, guaranteed minimum revenue of $2 million annually." Maria sat down heavily in her desk chair. $2 million annually would triple her company's current revenue and provide the kind of financial security she had never imagined possible. "But that's not all," Drake continued. "I also want to provide startup funding for you to expand your business. Hire more staff, open additional locations, maybe even franchise the concept. $500,000 in startup capital. No interest, no repayment schedule until you're profitable enough to handle it comfortably." Maria looked at him in stunned silence. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because you've created something remarkable here," Drake said. "You've built a business that doesn't just make money. It creates opportunities for people who need them. You've proven that success and social responsibility can work together." As Drake left each meeting, he felt something he had rarely experienced in his business career: the deep satisfaction of making decisions based on human value rather than profit margins. These weren't charitable gestures or publicity stunts. They were investments in people who had already proven their worth when it mattered most. But Drake wasn't finished. The individual gestures, meaningful as they were, represented something larger that was taking shape in his mind. He had seen firsthand that the real heroes in society weren't always the people with the biggest bank accounts or the highest profiles. They were the first responders, the healthcare workers, the entrepreneurs who created opportunities for others. That evening, Drake called a press conference to announce the creation of the Everyday Heroes Foundation, a charitable organization with an initial funding of $50 million, dedicated to supporting the people who keep society functioning: teachers, paramedics, nurses, firefighters, and small business owners who prioritize their employees' well-being. 3 days ago, I nearly died, Drake told the assembled reporters. I was saved not by fellow billionaires or famous doctors, but by 3 members of a catering staff who happened to have the training, the compassion, and the courage to act when it mattered most. They reminded me that heroism isn't about wealth or fame. It's about being prepared to help when help is needed most. 6 months later, on a crisp October evening, the Metropolitan Museum was once again hosting a charity gala. But this time everything was different. The event was called the Everyday Heroes Gala, and while the crystal chandeliers still sparkled and the guests still wore elegant evening attire, the entire atmosphere had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable just half a year earlier. Carlos Rodriguez stood near the entrance, but he wasn't carrying serving trays or clearing tables. He wore a well-tailored suit and a badge identifying him as Director of Global Emergency Response for Drake Industries. Over the past 6 months, he had transformed from an out-of-work EMT to the head of a worldwide safety program that had already made a measurable difference. His team had installed state-of-the-art emergency response systems in all Drake Industries facilities. They had trained over 2,000 employees in basic first aid and CPR. Most importantly, they had already responded to 14 workplace emergencies across 3 continents, saving lives that might otherwise have been lost. Just 2 weeks earlier, Carlos had received word that his protocols had helped save a construction worker who had suffered a heart attack at a Drake Industries data center in Austin. The on-site team, trained by Carlos's program, had provided immediate care until paramedics arrived. The worker was now home with his family, recovering fully. The ripple effect is incredible, Carlos had told his wife Anna just that morning. Every person we train becomes someone who can save a life. Every system we install becomes a safety net for families I'll never meet. Anna had smiled, watching her husband talk about work with the same passion he had once brought to his EMT career. Their children were proud to tell their friends that their father was helping keep people safe all around the world. The financial security was wonderful, but what mattered most was that Carlos was doing work that gave his life meaning again. Across the room, Dr. Jennifer Kim was engaged in animated conversation with a group of cardiologists and medical researchers. She was no longer working catering events on her nights off. Instead, she was leading groundbreaking research into early cardiac event detection, funded by a multi-million-dollar grant from the Everyday Heroes Foundation. Her research team had developed a new protocol for recognizing the subtle signs of cardiac distress that Carlos had noticed that night at the gala. They were testing wearable devices that could detect irregular heart patterns hours before a full cardiac event occurred. The preliminary results were so promising that 3 major medical centers had already requested to participate in expanded trials. We're looking at potentially preventing thousands of cardiac deaths annually, Jennifer explained to the interested physicians surrounding her. The technology exists to give people early warning, but until now nobody had focused on making it practical and affordable for everyday use. The research was personal for Jennifer. She knew that her own quick recognition of Drake's symptoms that night had been crucial, but she also knew that most people wouldn't have that kind of medical training. Her goal was to create systems that could give ordinary people the same life-saving advantages that medical professionals possessed. The financial freedom had been life-changing for Jennifer and her family. Her parents no longer worked multiple jobs to help support her education. Instead, they were able to enjoy their retirement while watching their daughter pursue research that could help millions of people. Jennifer's student loan debt was completely gone, allowing her to focus entirely on her medical career and research instead of worrying about money. At the center of the room's activity was Maria Santos, but she wasn't coordinating catering staff tonight. She was one of the honored guests, representing small business owners who had received support from the Everyday Heroes Foundation. Santos Catering had expanded dramatically, now operating in 4 cities and employing over 100 people. But Maria hadn't just grown her business, she had used it as a model for how companies could prioritize employee welfare while remaining profitable. She offered her workers health insurance, paid sick leave, and tuition assistance for those wanting to develop new skills. Her company had become a case study in business schools for sustainable employment practices. The foundation gave us the resources to do what we always wanted to do, Maria explained to a reporter who was covering the evening's events. We could hire more people, pay better wages, and still grow the business. It turns out that treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's good business. Maria's success had inspired other small business owners across the country. The Everyday Heroes Foundation had provided startup capital and mentorship to over 300 small businesses, with the requirement that they commit to fair employment practices and community involvement. The program was creating a network of companies that proved profitability and social responsibility could work together. Harrison, Drake moved through the evening's festivities with a contentment he had never experienced during his earlier years of business success. The foundation had grown beyond his wildest expectations, not just in terms of funding but in measurable impact. The $50 million in initial funding had leveraged additional donations and grants, totaling over $200 million in the first 6 months. But more than the numbers, Drake was struck by the stories. Teachers who had received grants to create innovative learning programs, paramedics who had been given advanced training opportunities, nurses who had started community health programs, firefighters who had developed new safety protocols. Each grant recipient represented lives improved and communities strengthened. The most remarkable thing, Drake told the assembled crowd during his brief remarks, is that we're not creating heroes tonight. We're simply recognizing and supporting heroes who already exist. They're the people who show up for work every day in jobs that keep our society functioning. They deserve our respect, our support, and our gratitude. The evening's format was deliberately different from traditional charity galas. Instead of wealthy donors being recognized for their contributions, the focus was entirely on the recipients of foundation support. First responders, healthcare workers, teachers, and small business owners shared their stories and talked about the impact the foundation had made on their work and their communities. One of the most moving presentations came from a group of paramedics in Detroit who had used foundation funding to establish a mobile crisis intervention program. They were responding to mental health emergencies with specially trained counselors alongside medical personnel, reducing both emergency room visits and police involvement in mental health situations. A teacher from rural Montana explained how her grant had allowed her to create a distance learning program that connected students in isolated communities with advanced courses and college preparation resources. Her work was now being replicated in rural schools across 12 states. As the evening drew to a close, Drake made one final announcement that surprised even his closest associates. He was stepping back from day-to-day operations at Drake Industries to focus entirely on the foundation's work. His company would continue to thrive under new leadership, but Drake had found his true calling in supporting the everyday heroes who had taught him the real meaning of success. 6 months ago, I collapsed on a stage not far from where we're standing tonight, Drake said to the crowd. I thought I was successful because I had built a profitable company and accumulated wealth. But I learned that night that real success is measured by how we support and uplift the people who make our communities stronger. The evening ended not with wealthy guests departing in luxury cars, but with first responders, teachers, healthcare workers, and small business owners networking and sharing ideas. These were the people who would return to their communities the next day and continue the work of making life better for others. Carlos, Jennifer, and Maria found themselves standing together near the end of the evening, reflecting on how much had changed since that dramatic night 6 months earlier. They had gone from being invisible service workers to leaders in their respective fields, all because they had chosen to act when action was needed most. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, Jennifer said, looking around at the celebration of people whose work actually improved lives every day. "It's real because it was always real," Maria replied. "The only thing that changed was that someone finally noticed what we were already doing." Carlos nodded, watching paramedics and firefighters sharing stories with teachers and nurses. "The best part is knowing that this is just the beginning. Every person here is going to go back to their community and make things better for someone else." As the last guests departed that night, the Metropolitan Museum had witnessed something unprecedented. A charity gala that had actually been about the people doing the charitable work, rather than the people writing the checks. It was a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or sit at head tables. Sometimes they wear uniforms, sometimes they wear scrubs, sometimes they wear aprons, and sometimes it takes a life-threatening crisis to reveal who the real heroes have been all along. The story that began with a medical emergency had become something much larger, a movement that recognized and supported the people who keep society functioning. It proved that when we pay attention to the right people and support the right work, everyone benefits. Most importantly, it showed that heroism isn't about wealth or fame. It's about being prepared to help when help is needed most, and sometimes that changes everything.